Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever walked into a room and felt the warmth turn cold? Or witnessed admiration turn into avoidance without a word exchanged? Perhaps someone once close to you now speaks with silence or worse, with subtle venom. This is not paranoia. This is not mere coincidence. You are witnessing a silent war. One that begins not in the world outside, but deep within the unseen landscapes of the human psyche. Let us explore why people, often without warning, begin to hate you, and why this phenomenon reveals far more about them than it does about you. People do not see you as you are, they see you as they are. This is the quiet tragedy behind much of human interaction, the reason why admiration can suddenly transform into aversion, why closeness can erode into distance. Each person walks around surrounded by a veil of their own past. Their experiences, their wounds, their buried emotions. What they call you is not truly you. It's a complex projection shaped by their own unconscious contents. And this is where the real conflict begins, not because you change, but because you touched something in them that had long been sleeping. The human psyche is like a dark room full of mirrors. When someone enters with a light, when you enter, fully yourself, honest in your being, unapologetic in your strength, it illuminates corners they've managed to avoid looking into. These corners contain the shadow parts of them's insecurity, jealousy, suppressed desires, shame, regrets. Your presence becomes a catalyst. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but simply by being. And yet the result can be hostility, subtle at first, disinterest in your good news, the absence of encouragement, avoidance of eye contact. Then it hardens into something colder, passive aggression, sarcasm, silence. Still they won't speak it aloud. They don't know why they're withdrawing. They believe the story they've created about you, even as it shifts week to week. You did not betray them. You did not lie. You did not wound them. You merely disrupted the internal balance they had built, one where they were either superior, or you were comfortably familiar, manageable, contained. Once you became too vibrant, too evolved, too clear, something inside them began to protest. The discomfort grows not because of who you are, but because of what it means for who they are. Your ambition reflects their complacency. Your courage unsettles their fear. Your clarity pierces through their confusion, not with intent but as a byproduct of authenticity. They see your joy and are reminded of the numbness they've normalized. They see your growth and are forced to confront their stagnation. They may not be able to name this dissonance, but they feel it in their bones. And rather than ask themselves, what can I learn from this person? They ask unconsciously, who do they think they are? Hatred, in this context, is a defense mechanism. A way to regain psychological equilibrium. Because it's far easier to label you as arrogant to admit they feel inadequate. It's easier to call you self-centered than to confess their own self-neglect. And so they attack, not with fists or shouts, but with withdrawal, gossip, resistance, emotional coldness. This is the silent war, the one you never saw coming. The one they don't even realize they're waging. They think they're protecting themselves from a threat. They don't know the threat is internal. That you've become a symbol, not a person. And this is where the pain intensifies. You start to question yourself. You wonder what changed, what you did, how to fix it. But there's nothing to fix. The connection you once shared was not rooted in mutual understanding. It was rooted in their comfort. Once you stepped out of the role they had cast for you. Once you stopped participating in the emotional economy they had constructed, they felt abandoned. But not because you left. Because you no longer reinforced the image they needed of themselves. In many relationships, we are unconsciously chosen not for who we are, but for what we validate in others. When you stop validating their sense of superiority, their identity as the wise one, the successful one, the caretaker, they experience an ego wound, and few people have the tools or maturity to sit with that wound and trace it inward. Most will lash out, withdraw, or reframe you as the villain. You'll hear them say you've changed, but what they really mean is, you're no longer who I need you to be so I can feel okay with myself. The irony is that these reactions often happen around moments of positive change. When you start healing, growing, succeeding, or simply becoming more self-aware, you expect people to celebrate you. But instead they turn away. It feels like betrayal, but it's actually displacement. They can't process their own feelings of envy, fear, or inadequacy, so they assign the discomfort to your presence. It's you who becomes too much, too distant, too proud. That way, they can preserve their image of themselves as the reasonable one. They can stay safe within their own narrative. This kind of sudden shift is disorienting. It can feel like emotional whiplash. One day you are embraced. The next, you're met with silence or judgment. And because the change is rarely communicated, you are left to fill in the blanks. You feel the weight of resentment in their tone. in their absence, in their sudden lack of interest in your well-being. But they'll never say it outright. It happens quietly, in glances not given, invitations not extended, messages not returned. The war is invisible but relentless. What makes this especially painful is that it's often those closest to you, family, old friends, colleagues you once trusted, who begin this quiet rejection. You feel the temperature drop, but you don't know where the cold is coming from. It seeps through cracks in conversation, in smiles that don't reach the eyes, in praise that sounds rehearsed. And because nothing is explicit, you're left to carry the confusion alone. It becomes a psychological haunting. You feel accused but no one tells you the crime. You feel hated but no one explains why. And still, you press on. You shine, you expand, you evolve, you refuse to shrink for the comfort of those who haven't yet confronted themselves. Because deep down, you understand that their hatred was never truly about you. It was about what you woke in them. A mirror is only painful to those who cannot bear to see what's inside. Most people walk through life wearing masks, carefully constructed identities stitched together from expectation, fear, and the desire to belong. These masks are not lies in the traditional sense. They are adaptations, compromises made to survive in a world that often punishes truth and rewards conformity. From an early age we are taught that to be accepted, we must first be agreeable, predictable, manageable. We learn the rules of the social game. Don't speak too loudly about your pain. Don't shine too brightly in your joy. Don't question what others have silently agreed to ignore. And so we begin to play along, shaping ourselves to fit the molds handed to us by family, culture, society. But then something happens, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. You stop playing the role. You begin to wake up. You begin to unlearn the lies you were taught to wear like armor. You begin to live more honestly, more freely, and without permission. This is when people begin to feel threatened, though they may not say it. Though they not even know why. Authenticity is unsettling to the inauthentic. When you begin to live from a place of inner truth, you become unpredictable. And to those who depend on the performance of others to stabilize their own identity, unpredictability is terrifying. You no longer smile to make others comfortable, you no longer shrink yourself to avoid outshining others, you no longer soften your opinions to keep the peace. And your very presence begins to challenge the invisible contracts they believed you had agreed to. Contracts that said you would not grow past them, not speak truths they were unwilling to face, not make different choices that make their own lives appear more confined. You begin to live as yourself, not as a reflection of their preferences. And this quietly threatens everything they've built their identity around. People don't fear your authenticity because it hurts them directly. They fear it because it calls their own inauthenticity into question. When you choose to live honestly, you force others to confront the dishonesty within themselves. This confrontation rarely comes with open dialogue. It comes with distant silence, or contempt disguised as concern. They may say you've changed, that you've become selfish or cold or too intense. But what they really mean is that your freedom is exposing their self-imposed limitations. Your willingness to walk your own path calls into question why they haven't walked theirs. Your emotional transparency threatens their repression. Your clarity unsettles their confusion. Your refusal to play small reminds them of how long they've stayed hidden. And so they turn on you. Not because you have wronged them, but because you have left the role they assigned you in their internal play. In a world built on roles and rules, the authentic person becomes a disruptive force. You may not speak louder than before, but your words now carry the weight of conviction. You may not move differently, but your posture no longer bends in submission. You may not even intend to change the dynamics, but your very presence begins to rewire the emotional architecture of the spaces you occupy. People sense this shift, and not everyone welcomes it. Some will try to pull you back into the role you once played, using guilt, nostalgia, or emotional withdrawal to nudge you into the familiar shape you've outgrown. Others will distance themselves entirely, interpreting your authenticity as arrogance, your self-respect as rejection, your boundaries as betrayal. They will say you've become difficult, dramatic, or distant, when in truth, you've just become real. The most tragic part of this transformation is that many of these people will never admit what they're feeling. They won't say, "Your growth makes me uncomfortable because I haven't allowed myself to grow." They won't say, "Your honesty forces me to reckon with my own avoidance." Instead, they'll create narratives that preserve their ego and project the discomfort onto you. You'll be painted as the problem, the one who changed, the one who broke the unspoken pact of mutual pretense. It's easier to resent you than to re-examine themselves. It's safer to hate what they can't control than to question why they feel so unsettled by your freedom. What they truly want is not to destroy you, but to silence the reminder you've become. Your life begins to act as a mirror, and for those unwilling to look within, mirrors become unbearable. You may feel the sting of their withdrawal, the ache of relationships once full of warmth now cooled by unspoken tensions. You may find yourself excluded, not for wrongdoing, but for truth-telling. You may become the target of whispered criticisms, of carefully curated misunderstandings, of accusations that seem detached from reality. But behind it all is a simple truth they cannot face. Your authenticity has disrupted the illusion they were still trying to protect. This is not to say that everyone around you will turn away. Some will be drawn closer, inspired by your courage, awakened by your example. But those who've built their identity on fragile foundations will feel the tremors your truth causes. And not all will withstand it. To them your evolution feels like an earthquake. They cannot name it, but they feel it. They sense that something inside them is being stirred by your refusal to remain hidden. And rather than explore that stirring, they resist it. The resistance takes many forms: dismissal, distancing, even disdain, but the root is always the same. A fear of facing the parts of themselves that you have unknowingly illuminated. You may be tempted to explain yourself, to soften your edges, to return to the familiar for the sake of keeping the peace. But the peace was never real if it required your silence. The closeness was never honest if it depended on your conformity. What you are feeling is the consequence of choosing yourself in a world where many have not. And while it can feel like rejection, it is in truth a revelation. You are no longer compatible with roles that diminish you, with relationships that require performance, with spaces that cannot hold the weight of your truth. And though this loss may sting, what remains is freedom, the kind that cannot be taken back. The kind that reveals who was truly with you, and who was only with the version of you that didn't make them uncomfortable. Every person carries within them a shadow, a hidden side of the self that is not necessarily evil but repressed, denied, or disowned. This shadow is built from everything we were told not to be, everything we learned to push down in order to be accepted, loved, or simply to survive. It holds our anger, our envy, our fear, our desires we dare not acknowledge even in silence. And while we may pretend it doesn't exist, the shadow does not disappear, it waits. It waits in the corners of our personality, leaking out through sarcasm, resentment, passive aggression, or bursts of emotion that seem out of proportion to the moment. Most people never confront their shadow directly because doing so would mean facing parts of themselves they've been taught to hate or fear. So instead, the psyche protects itself by projecting that darkness onto others, assigning external targets for internal discomfort. This is where you come in. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you've triggered something they haven't dealt with. You become the screen upon which they project their own shadow. Your confidence becomes their image of arrogance. Your independence is reframed as coldness, your clarity becomes stubbornness. Without realizing it, they are no longer responding to you as you are, but to a distorted version of you shaped by the parts of themselves they refuse to claim. They don't see your actions, they see their interpretation, colored by their own denied emotions. You become the villain in a story that has nothing to do with actual character and everything to do with their unacknowledged pain. It is easier to see the enemy outside than the chaos within. So when you say something honest, they feel attacked. When you set a boundary, they feel abandoned. When you succeed, they feel diminished. These reactions are not rational, they're psychological defense mechanisms. You have stirred the waters of their unconscious, not by confrontation, but simply by being yourself. And because the shadow resists being seen, it must assign blame. That blame lands on you. Not because you are bad or wrong, but because you were available, present, different enough to be made into the container of what they could not hold within themselves. This process is rarely conscious. They truly believe what they feel is justified. Their story about you becomes reality in their mind, because it supports the narrative that keeps their identity intact. They may begin to speak poorly of you to others, not to destroy you, but to reinforce the illusion that you are the source of the disturbance. Gossip becomes a tool of projection, a way to validate their discomfort without having to examine it. The more people they convince, the more real their version of events feels. In their mind, you are now the liar, the manipulator, the problem, not because you actually are, but because they need you to be in order to of looking inward. This is the silent war. The one waged in half, thoughts and quiet judgments, in emotional distance and sudden hostility. You feel the shift, but it's hard to name because it doesn't come with a declaration. It comes with hesitation in their voice, a subtle change in their tone, the way their compliments begin to carry an edge. You're left questioning yourself, wondering if you said something wrong, if you could have handled things differently, but nothing clear presents itself. That's the nature of projection. It's invisible until it erupts, and when it does, it rarely reflects the truth. What makes this dynamic more painful is that it often happens with people who once claimed to care about you. Friends, family, partners, even colleagues. Those who once supported you begin retreat, and their absence is not explained. You may try to repair what feels broken, but because the root is unconscious, there is no conversation that can fix it. They don't want resolution. They want distance from the parts of themselves you've made too visible. Your growth, your self-awareness, your presence has become unbearable not because you are harmful, but because you have become a mirror they are not ready to face. It's not that they hate you in a personal, deliberate way. Hate is rarely pure in this context. It is a mask for deeper discomfort. The shadow hates being seen. It reacts with resistance, denial, and projection because to integrate the shadow would mean admitting imperfection, vulnerability, and fear. Most people are not taught how to do this. They are taught to maintain a positive image, to suppress what doesn't fit, to blame the external world for internal pain. And so when someone comes along who lives with more honesty, who speaks plainly, who doesn't play by the unspoken rules, who sets boundaries and tells the truth, it disturbs the balance. You become a threat to the fragile structure they've built around their identities. Sometimes they will even convince themselves they are protecting others by turning against you. In their mind, you are dangerous because you disrupt harmony, because you challenge norms, because you changed. They remember a version of you that was easier for them to handle, and they want that version back, not because they loved it more, but because it asked less of them. You were quieter then, less confrontational, less aware, less free. Now you hold your ground, now you name things. Now you won't let things slide. That strength, while necessary for your growth, becomes unbearable to those who are still living in compromise. They may not leave loudly. They may just fade. Conversations become shorter, messages go unanswered, invitations stop arriving, and you are left in the strange silence of a war you didn't start, fighting ghosts that were never yours. You look for explanations, for clarity, but the truth is buried in a place they themselves have not accessed, and even if you could explain it, it wouldn't matter, because their shadow has already decided who you are. Logic cannot reach the place where projection lives. The image has been cast, and your reality no longer fits the role they've assigned it. Time, you begin to see it for what it is, not personal, but archetypal. A pattern that plays out again and again when someone refuses to confront their inner world. You become the scapegoat, the vessel for pain they cannot acknowledge. And while it hurts, this clarity frees you from the need to defend yourself. You stop trying to be understood by those who cannot even understand themselves. You stop fighting for a connection that was only ever conditional on your silence. And in that space, you find something deeper than acceptance. You find truth. Not the version of truth shaped by comfort, but the kind forged in fire, born in solitude, and sustained by the quiet knowing that you did not cause the darkness. You only revealed it. We are taught from a young age to celebrate others, to clap when someone wins, to be happy when good things happen to people around us. And on the surface, many people do exactly that. They smile, they say the right words, they appear supportive, but beneath that practiced surface there often brews something more difficult to name. Something darker, more primal, something that doesn't align with what we claim to value. And that something is envy. Not the passing kind that quickly dissolves, but the deep, persistent kind that sits quietly in the subconscious, feeding off comparisons and insecurities, masked in civility but pulsing underneath even the most polished interactions. And this is the hidden current that shapes the silent shifts in relationships when you begin to rise, when you evolve. Emotionally, spiritually, professionally. You think the people around you will naturally celebrate you, that your growth will inspire, uplift, and motivate them. That your victories will be seen as shared joy. But human nature doesn't always work that way. Especially when your evolution forces others to confront their own stagnation. Because the moment your life begins to reflect movement, progress, clarity, or peace, those who have not found the courage or direction to seek those things in their own lives feel exposed. Not because you said anything. Not because you tried to show them up. But because your being now holds a contrast that wasn't there before. You unintentionally become a spotlight. Not on your achievements but on their unspoken disappointments. And that light, no matter how pure, becomes unbearable to those still living in the shadows of their own potential. So they begin to pull away, not with confrontation, not with honesty, but with distance disguised as disinterest, with passive resentment masked as sarcasm, with superficial praise that doesn't quite land the way it used to. And suddenly the warmth turns cool, the laughter shortens, the shared joy begins to feel hollow, and though nothing was said aloud you feel it. The invisible wall, the quiet rejection, the subtle recalibration of closeness that says, without saying, you've stepped out of place. The truth is that many people are comfortable with you when you are struggling. When you're unsure. When your dreams are still forming and your confidence still fragile, because in that state, you are familiar, relatable, and non-threatening. Your presence affirms their own choices, validates their position, allows them to feel generous, important, needed. But once you step into your own power, once your clarity begins to replace confusion, once you stop looking for validation and start moving with intention, the dynamic begins to shift, not by your doing, but by the quiet friction that arises when one person changes and the other does not. This is where envy begins its silent work. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't accuse, it questions subtly. It doesn't argue, it withdraws just enough to be noticed but not enough to be called out. And it often comes wrapped in politeness, in congratulations that don't quite ring true, in compliments that carry a sting, in concerns that seem helpful but are designed to pull you back to the place where they felt safer with you. Because your growth, while not malicious, disrupts the unspoken emotional agreement that kept the relationship in balance, and in many cases, that agreement was built on your limitation. They will never say, I liked you better when you were unsure of yourself. Or your success reminds me that I gave up on mine. But the body speaks before the mouth does, and you will notice the hesitation, the shift in tone, the way your wins are met with silence or quick topic changes, and the absence of real joy from those who once support you begins to speak louder than any words could. And this absence is a form of grief. Not your own, but theirs. The grief of watching someone become what they told themselves wasn't possible. The grief of realizing that your evolution means they have one less excuse for their own lack of movement. Because envy is a feeling most people are ashamed to admit, it doesn't get processed directly, it gets displaced, redirected, covered with layers of moral reasoning and emotional logic that seem rational but are rooted in insecurity. And so you may hear that you've become arrogant, or that you've changed, or that you're out of touch. And these claims might come from people who never asked what your journey required, who never sat with you through the nights of doubt, who never witnessed the discipline, the sacrifice, the inner battles, and still feel entitled to refine your story through the lens of their discomfort. Sometimes they will cloak their envy in unsolicited advice, disguised as concern, saying things like, just be careful not to get ahead of yourself, or, don't forget where you came from. As if your progress is a danger. As if your joy is a threat that must be contained, and in these moments, you'll recognize that it's not really about you. It's about their narrative, their fear, their unwillingness to evolve alongside you, and it will hurt, not because of their words, but because of what their withdrawal reveals about the foundation of the relationship. How much of it was contingent on your staying in a role that made them feel secure, and in this unraveling, you'll be faced with a difficult choice. To shrink yourself in order to preserve the illusion of closeness, or to continue expanding, knowing it may cost you certain relationships, and knowing either path is without pain. Only one leads to truth, because growth is not betrayal, evolution is not abandonment, and becoming more of who you truly are is not something to apologize for. Even if others can't meet you there, their envy does not make them evil. It makes them human. But being human does not absolve them of responsibility, because what we feel is not always our fault. But how we act upon it is always our choice, and if their choice is to distance, to criticize, to make you feel guilty for what you've earned through inner work and integrity, then their place in your story may need to change. Not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. As you continue on your path, you will learn that not everyone is meant to walk beside you, and that the loneliness of growth is not a punishment but a purification, making space for those who can love you in your fullness, not just your fragments. For those who do not flinch in the presence of your light, because they found their own. And until those people arrive or reveal themselves, you will carry your truth alone if you must, knowing that the price of authenticity is high, but the cost of denying it is far greater without realizing it. People often place invisible contracts upon you, agreements never spoken aloud but deeply felt and unconsciously enforced, rules that say who you're allowed to be, how far you're allowed to grow, what role you must continue to play in their life, so they can feel stable in their identity and comfortable in their world. And these contracts are forged not in truth but in familiarity, often written silently in moments of shared vulnerability, early closeness, mutual limitation, or emotional dependence. And as long as you remain within the bounds of who they expect you to be, everything appears harmonious, the relationship seems solid. But that stability is fragile, because it's conditional on your staying the same. People create images of you in their minds, and those images become fixtures in their psychological structure. And any deviation from the role they've assigned you feels like a personal betrayal. Not because you've done anything harmful, but because your change forces them to question the validity of the emotional contract they never consciously admitted to making. And so when you begin to grow, when you find your voice, when you create boundaries, when you heal parts of yourself that used to mirror theirs, something in them begins to react. And a reaction is not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's a slow withdrawal, a shift in tone, a subtle tightening in the connection that once felt effortless. They might say things like, "You've changed." Not as a celebration, but as an accusation, because in their world, change means instability, unpredictability, a disruption of the balance they relied on. And in truth, what they mean is that you're no longer fulfilling the emotional function you once did. You're no longer their source of reassurance, of validation, of shared pain, of quiet complicity in staying small. And this is where the silent unraveling begins, not in conflict but in confusion, not in words but in energy. And you start to feel that you've become too much or not enough. When really, you've just become different from the version of yourself they preferred. You may have been the listener, the fixer, the one who always had space for their emotions while ignoring your own. And now you need space too, and suddenly the warmth cools, the bond loosens. Because you've violated the part of the contract that said your needs would never disrupt their comfort. Or perhaps you were the one who struggled, who leaned on them, and they felt important in that dynamic, useful, central. And now that you've grown stronger, now that you no longer depend on them in the same way, they feel displaced, irrelevant, quietly wounded by your independence. And rather than acknowledge this shift with honesty, they retreat or lash out, hoping to pull you back into the role where their identity felt more secure. These unspoken contracts are often rooted in emotional survival strategies, in the fear of abandonment, in unresolved childhood dynamics. And they are maintained through unexamined repetition rather than intention. So when you begin to question patterns, when you start breaking cycles, when you choose healing over harmony, you threaten the foundation upon which these contracts were built. And the reaction is rarely logical, because you are now touching something beneath language, beneath rationality, something ancient and unprocessed. And your transformation becomes the trigger they never anticipated, the change agent they never consented to but can no longer ignore. It might manifest as criticism disguised as concern, where they question your choices not to understand them, but to undermine them. Or as emotional withdrawal meant to punish you for stepping outside the role they assigned. Or as a sudden rewriting of the past, where your efforts, your love, your presence are reframed through a lens of suspicion or resentment. Because that allows them to distance themselves without confronting the real discomfort. And you're left wondering what went wrong, when all you did was choose to live more honestly, to evolve beyond the shape they grew used to seeing. In truth, you didn't break the contract. They did, the moment they stopped seeing you as a whole, evolving being and began relating to you only through the narrow role they had cast for you. And what makes this dynamic so difficult is that they often don't know they're doing it. They believe they're reacting to something you've done, when in fact they're reacting to the collapse of a structure that was never meant to last. Because no living person can remain frozen in the expectations of another without eventually losing themselves. There's a subtle grief in this, not only for them but for you too. Because when someone withdraws from you over changes you made to survive or thrive, it exposes the conditional nature of the connection. It reveals that what felt like love may have been dependency. What felt like support may have been control. What felt like intimacy may have been a form of emotional management. And letting go of that illusion is painful, especially when there are memories of closeness, of shared laughter, of real affection, because those moments were real. But the dynamic has shifted, and pretending otherwise only deepens the wound. Sometimes you will try to renegotiate the contract consciously, to speak your truth gently, to offer clarity, to invite them into your evolution. But not everyone is ready for that level of honesty. Not everyone wants to grow alongside you. And you'll find that some people would rather hold on to their idea of you, and meet the version of you that's emerging. And this rejection, though quiet, is one of the deepest kinds, because it's not your flaws being turned away. It's your growth, your wholeness, your light. And you will be tempted to dim that light, to shrink, to revert to the old role just to bring them back close. But the closeness that requires your self-abandonment is not love, it's bondage. And while the loss of those who can't accept your becoming is hard to bear, it clears the space for those who can meet you as you are, not as you were needed to be. And the truth is, You were never responsible for fulfilling unspoken roles that kept others emotionally comfortable. Your only responsibility is to live in alignment with who you truly are becoming. And those who can't love you there were never loving the real you to begin with, only the reflection of themselves they saw in you. And as that reflection shifts, their presence fades, but your authenticity remains, stronger than any silent contract ever written in the shadows of your old self. So what do you do when people suddenly start hating you? You let them, because their hatred is not your burden to carry. It is the echo of their own inner conflict, a conflict you merely awakened, not created. In a world afraid of its own reflection, the honest soul will always be misunderstood. But do not dim your light to soothe the blindness of others. The silent war is real, but it is not yours to fight. Stay rooted, stay clear, stay whole, and remember this: when people hate you without cause, it is often because you remind them of the truth they are not ready to face. Thank you.